Hello, Professor and classmates, and thank you for listening to my exploration on Ansel Adams. I learned a lot while researching him, and I hope you may learn one new thing also. This smiling man on the right is Ansel Adams, photographer and environmentalist. I chose to learn more about Ansel Adams because of his stunning photographs of Yosemite Valley, and I first learned of him after hiking Half Dome in Yosemite in 2015, one of the locations he frequented. The day after the trip, I stumbled into the Ansel Adams Visitor Gallery on the floor of Yosemite Valley, which was full of visitors admiring his work. This is Ansel Adams as a child. Ansel Adams, known as AA to his friends, was born February 20th, 1902 in the Outer Richmond neighborhood of San Francisco, a city that was only 50 years old at the time. He was born into privilege. He was the only child and grandson of an oil baron, and this was his house on the right, which he grew up in amidst the windswept sand dunes of the Golden Gate. He was described as a nervous child, full of scattered energy, and he may have had dyslexia. In 1906, when he was 4 years old, he suffered a broken nose in an aftershock from the 1906 earthquake when he was thrown against a garden wall. His nose would remain crooked, and he was a mouth breather all his life. Interestingly, his house still stands today, but the large house next door fell into a giant sinkhole in 1995. Neighbors had hoped to convert the vacant lot into an Ansel Adams grove and fill it with oak trees, but instead it was subdivided and sold. This is Ansel Adams as a young man. He had little formal photography training. He struggled in school before his father withdrew him at age 13, choosing to homeschool him. This granted him a great freedom and opportunity to pursue his own interests, which were exploring nature around the Golden Gate. In lieu of school, Charles Adam gave his son in 1915 a year-long pass to the Panama Pacific Exposition, and it was here where young Ansel was exposed to modern painting and sculpture for the first time. He took up piano when he was 12 years old and often would practice for hours a day. It wasn't until he was 14, when his aunt gave him a book on Yosemite, that he became enamored and he badgered his family to visit. 2 years later, in 1916, his family made the 2-day journey by train to Yosemite. Once at the gates, his father gave him a surprise, a Kodak No. 1 Brox Brownie camera, which he had no idea how to use, and he set off with no experience of taking photos, learning as he went. Yosemite captivated him. For most of his teens and 20s, Ansel would go back and forth between music and the mountains. In 1919, at the age of 17, he joined the Sierra Club, which focused on environmental preservation. You can see him here with his clubmates on a day trip out. This group would later influence him greatly, and he would be involved with it for 31 years, petitioning for the protection of the Yosemite wilderness. Ansel would often practice piano 6 hours a day in the winter, and then he would spend every summer in Yosemite, where he taught himself how to develop and print photos. It was here at age 19 he met his wife, Virginia Best. He originally thought music was the safer career route. He would go back and forth between music and photography for 7 more years, and it wasn't until 1927, when he met Alfred Bender, an influential arts patron, that he became fully engaged with photography. This is Ansel, and to his left is Virginia Best. They were married for 50 years. They shared interests in music, as she was training as a classical singer. It was said she could out-hike Ansel and often accompanied him on trips. Here are a few of his most popular works. Adams was the first 20th century photographer to capture the American West in black and white crystal photographs instead of the soft focus that was popular in the 1920s. We see here each image is notable for clarity. There is drama, it's taken at dawn or dusk or in storms, and rarely just simple landscapes. You may be familiar with some of his significant works. To the left is Monolith, the Face of Half Dome, Moonrise, Moon and Half Dome. The photo to the right is Winter Clearing in Yosemite. This was Ansel's highest valued photograph. It sold in New York in 2010 for $722,500. Some of these photographs made it into his first portfolio, called Parmelian Prints of the High Sierras. He took many photos and many negatives over his lifetime. He published over 1,500 photos, but less than 100 of those are well known. Here we see in his a few other of his famous works. He believed strongly in and was a founder of using visualization, which is today referred to as pre-visualization. This involves the photographer standing in front of a scene and seeing the final image in their mind, right down to post-processing, before even pressing the shutter. Adams would spend hours hiking and trekking up mountains with heavy gear, sometimes even taking a burro with him, carrying 100 pounds of food, photography equipment, to get the exact angle and elements he was known for. In his autobiography, Ansel states, one morning in summer 1923, while observing a storm in Yosemite Valley, he was awestruck and decided he wanted to spend the rest of his life trying to capture what he felt that morning. And we get that feeling of grandeur, the beauty of the outdoors, in his photos. He would also use the zone system, which was a system he founded that places a numeric value on each degree of shade and light, 0 for pure black to 10 for pure white. And it is interesting that he did this because although he abandoned music for photography, it's clear that he integrated his knowledge of music into his art, as observed by his complete use of grayscale to create contrast. So he would often compare the piano to his photos, which was a unique talent that he had as a cross between pianist and photographer. Another technique that Ansel would use is horizon lines. He often places horizon lines high in the frame. We see the cliffs high towards the top of the frame, making the mountain or tree appear to tower above the viewer. And this creates, again, the feelings of grandeur, of beauty. Again, with parallel lines in Haleakala crater, he places it at the top of the frame. In the Tetons, we see the use of parallel lines with the Snake River very well centered in the middle of the screen. Contrast and negative spaces are often staples to his work. When I was researching Ansel Adams, I was surprised at how far he traveled in the 1930s, 1940s. He would take these Guggenheim scholarships, and this took him to New Mexico, California, Wyoming, Hawaii. So he was very well traveled in a time when the automobile was still being relatively new to most people. He rarely took photographs of people, but occasionally he would. And again, here we see the high horizon lines in the saguaro cactus. He really wants to portray the dramatic, the powerful image of nature in his photographs. I included this photograph of San Francisco as it doesn't look too different from San Francisco today. Ansel Adams worked very hard, and most of his photos were taken from the 1930s to the 1960s. He'd often work long days and then process photos at night. He would use these photos to create environmental impact as the Sierra Club director for 31 years. He would often lobby photos and take photos to Congress and say, look at the beauty of these places, we need to protect them. It was said at one point he was the only photographer who could pick up the phone and have a direct line to President Roosevelt. And this resulted in 1940 President Roosevelt signing into law the protection of King Canyons National Park. In the 1960s, Adams was unfortunately inflicted with gout, arthritis, and he began to slow down, could no longer get out into the mountains as much, and he naturally stepped into the role of teacher, public figure, environmental activist. His work helped to establish photography as a legitimate art at a time when portrait art was seen as art, but photography was not as clear in the art space. And he contributed greatly to the American conservation movement. 6 months after his death, Congress recognized his impact to the environment by naming a parcel of land the Ansel Adams Wilderness. And we see here Ansel Adams in 1982 in front of his beloved piano. In 1983, he would make his last trip to Yosemite, and in 1984, he passed, at 82 years old, he passed away from cardiovascular disease. In 1985, posthumously, a remote 11,760-foot peak in Northern California was named Ansel Adams. This yellow line is the John Muir Trail, which Adams wrote a book about, and the King Canyons Park is what he fought so hard to protect. So if you ever go to King Canyons National Park, you can think of Ansel Adams' work that he did there. I was curious as to where Mount Ansel Adams was located and if it was easy to access. It turns out it's relatively remote, and it's about a 35 to 40 mile approach in, so not very easy to hike or get to. And I'll leave you with a couple Ansel Adams quotes that capture his spirit of how he processed the mountains and how he wanted his photos to be seen. Thank you for letting me share about the life and work of Ansel Adams. When I was doing this, I found out that there is an Ansel Adams exhibit currently on in the De Young Museum in April to July 2023. Over 100 works on Adams are for you, so really worth checking out. Thank you so much for your time. Here are my resources.